All right, welcome everybody to this Designing Native Habitat in Gardens workshop. So thank you for those of you who actually made it in real life to our event. We've also got people online streaming through Zoom. So please bear with us with the technology and the camera movements. So this workshop's brought to you by Waverley Council, Woollahra Council and Randwick Council, and also by the New South Wales Environmental Trust. I am Vicky Bachelard. I work at Waverley Council in the sustainability team, and I coordinate the Living Connections programme, which it's an environmental trust grant-funded programme where we help residents create small bird habitat in their gardens. And that's why we're putting on this workshop today to support that programme. As it seems the natural next step to, we've been talking to residents about creating habitats, and now we need to talk to the professional gardeners from you guys. So if you haven't already done your COVID check-in, could you please go and do that? And I think just help people in the room, just help yourself to some tea and coffee and refreshments. We're going to go through till about 5:30. For those of you in the room, to get to the toilets, you need to go outside in the outdoor world, I'm afraid, out of this door and go 2 doors down and then back in again. There is going to be a class happening in the next room, so we can't walk through there. If you're at home with Zoom, go to the toilet anytime you like. So we've got 3 presentations today. And we've got, Sue's over there. So we've got 4 guest speakers today. I'm going to introduce them. So Narelle Happ, who's sitting in the middle over here. Narelle is a garden designer, horticulturalist who specialises in native garden and permaculture design. She has over 15 years experience and is passionate about creating living spaces which are nurturing, productive and sustainable. Narelle has a garden design company called Garden for Life and offers native garden and permaculture design services, as well as a range of educational workshops. We also have Steve Batley. Steve is a landscape architect, a permaculture designer, an educator, and he describes himself as an urban farm creator. Steve has over 20 years of practical application designing, building and managing permaculture-based ecosystems. Steve is the director of Sydney Organic Gardens, and he loves giving people the skills, knowledge and mindset to manage their own productive ecosystem. He works with architects, planners, landscape architects, developers and the public to provide specialist design and advice, as well as education. And we have Mark DeWolf. Mark is a horticulturalist and garden designer with extensive knowledge in bush regeneration and creating wildlife-friendly gardens. Mark has been working with clients to create native gardens since 2003. He conducts bush regeneration along Sydney's coastal region, the national parks, golf courses and councils, including Waverley Council. Mark has his own business called Landmark Gardens, and he also works with Waverley Council on our Living Connection programme, providing advice to the residents. And our 4th guest speaker is Sue Stevens. Sue is the Urban Ecology Coordinator at Waverley Council, where she oversees the implementation of natural resource management, bush regeneration and protection of the ecological communities. Sue has a holistic and action-focused approach to ecological restoration work that centres on the repair and recreation of natural landscapes and fauna habitat. As part of Sue's postgraduate studies in natural resource management, she completed a research project and thesis on small bird habitat in the urban landscape. Sue's areas of special interest include native vegetation, birds, the importance of plants and nature for human health, and the space where art and environmental restoration intersects. For those of you online, if you have any questions, we're going to, in between each presentation, we'll have time for questions. So if anything comes up for you, please put it in the chat and Michelle will respond and ask those at the right time. I know a lot of you did submit some questions when you registered for the workshop, so thank you for those. I think a lot of them will get answered during the presentations. but I have got a list of them and we'll try to bring those in as well when we can. Okay, so we're going to hear from Sue first. Sue is presenting on the issues surrounding the loss of small birds in the urban environment and what the requirements are of small birds and how we can introduce those into our gardens.
Hi, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to you in the room. You seem quite far away. And good afternoon to you on Zoom. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Eastern Sydney coastal area.
I haven't got the screen sharing yet.
I haven't got the screen sharing up yet. So before I do an acknowledgement, I will just make an apology. There was some bird call sounds in my presentation that seemed to have flown away. So that'll be just me speaking. Okay, right. So yes, Vicky said I'm the council's, Waverley Council's Urban Ecology Co-ordinator. I've also worked for 5 other councils in the bush regeneration industry and as a consultant to councils, NGOs and landscape architects in private practice. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Eastern Sydney coastal area, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and for wherever you're coming from soon, the traditional custodians of wherever you are, and acknowledge their elders past and present. And just while we're on the topic of acknowledgement and reconciliation, restoring biodiversity and creating habitat is caring for country in action and is a powerful act of reconciliation. Whether you're doing it as bush regenerator or on private land, you're restoring something that we need back, balance of ecology. There's been a lot of research and reporting in recent years of the benefits of being in nature, and a lot of us over the last 12 or 15 months have experienced this for ourselves. As many of us, not me, have had a chance to slow down and explore our local parks and urban bushland. And early research from 1984 found that people recovering from stomach surgery healed faster when they had a view of a garden compared to those looking out onto a brick wall. Subsequent studies have not only just confirmed this, but found that it's the diversity of the greenness that facilitates recovery and well-being. In other words, being in or viewing a garden with a wide diversity of plant species, plant habitats and flowering times is better for your physical and mental health than looking at a row of the same trees or a neatly mowed lawn. So we have to get this message across to the fashion of landscape design and also some of those TV shows. And anyone who's spent time in nature knows that a bushwalk is more interesting and makes you feel better than a walk across a playing field. You can observe the wonders of birds and insects, whether it's on a 20k bushwalk or having a cup of tea in the garden. Even small inner city backyards can have a great variety of native bees, butterflies, dragonflies and so on. Diversity of plants and small fauna add to the aesthetics and beauty of our surroundings in both clearly visible and more subtle ways. The work you do as landscapers and designers, if done in a thoughtful, conscious way, can be of benefit to the wildlife and can improve human well-being because everything's connected. Increasing floristic diversity in parks and gardens provides more opportunities for other plants and animals to find a home, to survive and to thrive. For example, by providing habitat for bird, insect and bat pollinators. So today I'm going to talk about small bird habitat. As Vicky mentioned, the Living Connections project wanted to specifically address the loss of small birds in our eastern suburbs landscape. And we chose 2 species, the New Holland honeyeater and the superb prairie wren, as our flagship species. But as everything is connected, other small bird species and fauna such as insects and lizards will also benefit from improving diversity in our gardens. One of the main issues for these small birds is that the shrub layer is gone, and these birds really don't have anywhere left to hide from predators and aggressive species, or to raise a family or move through the landscape. And for insectivores, a lot of their food source is gone as well. I'm going to talk about how to go about trying to restore this habitat for small birds so that we can repopulate our parks and gardens and move towards restoring some of the balance that has gone the way of the bigger, more aggressive and carnivorous birds. Specifically, I'm going to talk about structure of vegetation, plant species, ones to include and ones not to include, and other important factors like predators and bullies. If you have any questions, please, for those in the room, please write them down. If you're on Zoom, please put them in the chat. Now, the next screen was going to have a bird sound of an eastern spinebill. It's all but disappeared from our landscape in the city. There might be some in the national parks or in more rural areas, but you don't really see them around here anymore. And this is a common story for small birds. The museum, Australian Museum, has data from birds from 1900, and a researcher in the year 2000 compared current bird species in Sydney to that museum data, and they found that there was a lot more now. There's a lot more carnivorous birds, there's a lot more bigger birds, whether it's cockatoos or bigger honeyeaters, and a lot less small birds. And as an example, only 2 species of parrot were present in Sydney in 1900, and they were small parrots. One of those was the ground parrot. And there was no rainbow lorikeets, there was no sulphur-crested cockatoos. So we've really changed things towards benefiting bigger, carnivorous and more aggressive birds. Another bird that we've still got hanging in a little bit is the grey fantail. The New-Holland honeyeater is hanging in, not quite so well as the next bird, but it's still there, and it's one of our flagship species for our project. And the superb fairy wren. Everyone loves the superb fairy wren, and if I have time, I will tell you a story about their promiscuous ways. But look, small birds can't fly far. They're not like bigger birds. They really need lots of stepping stones through the landscape, and they need shelter whenever they stop. Otherwise, they're going to be swooped by a predator. And it's that shrub layer that they used to use that's disappeared a lot from our landscape. You go to a park and you've often got trees and grass or low ground covers, and that whole shrub layer that's 1.5 to 3 metres high has just disappeared. So most of the next part of this talk will be about the superb fairy wren, because we've got more data. Everyone loves the superb fairy wren. They're cute, they're colourful, and consequently some more research has been done on what they like and what they don't like. This is a map of superb fairy wren sightings in the eastern suburbs. You can see there's a lot along the coastline, and then there's a big concentration in Centennial Park and another cluster down here at Randwick Environment Park. So there's no way really for those Centennial Park birds to get through the landscape and meet up with those coastal ones and interbreed and create more families. We don't think. Here's a bit closer in example of the same kind of data, but this researcher has, as well as marked on the map where there are superb fairy wrens, has also marked where there are not superb fairy wrens. So the first map, we just knew where they were, but this researcher has actually gone to public parks in between the coast and Centennial Park and found that there are none. We don't know too much about what's on private property, because that involves a big citizen science project that would involve surveying a lot of residents. And we have included surveys as part of the Living Connections program, but it's not reaching everyone. sort of above Centennial Park, there's a nice grid suburb above the eastern side of Centennial Park. That's Queen's Park, the suburb of Queen's Park. And Queen's Park is quite a leafy suburb. It's got some really lovely big street trees. But do we think it's really good for small birds? From what I'm hearing from residents who ring me up and say that they used to have small birds and they've gone, and that they've been eaten by other larger birds, I would suspect that the trees are being a really good habitat for larger birds to move around, but the small birds just can't survive. And a lot of government, both at state and local council area levels, map habitat corridors from that kind of aerial look. That's where the greenness is, so that's where we'll map our corridors. So here's a map of the whole of eastern Sydney with the habitat corridors marked in orange. And it's really just mapping where there's big patches of green. So it's not always the right habitat for small fauna. And I'd argue that it's right habitat for large fauna and not much more. Birds like currawongs that are known predators of fairy wrens and their eggs and other small birds, as well as reptiles, and all those fruits on those lily pillies that everyone loves planting. Any small colourful fruits, the currawong will be attracted to those too. Blueberry ash, all those trees we love to recommend. Of course, there's other reasons that we're losing small birds. We all know about cats, so I won't bang on about cats. But these carnivorous birds are quite responsible for quite a few fairy wren disappearances. This is a juvenile butcher bird with a male fairy wren in his beak here. So we need to put back some of that habitat for the small birds. But what are we going to plant? A lot of people will say plant Australian natives, like this one. But this is probably not the right species for a small bird. Wild noisy miners don't eat small birds. They are aggressive, they hang around in packs, and they'll chase just about any other bird, even those much bigger than themselves, and cats and other animals out of their territory. And I'll talk a bit more about noisy miners in a bit. But one of the points I really want to get through to the message on this presentation is that not all natives are the same in terms of bird habitat or small bird habitat. This is what came up when I googled Australian native garden. Does anyone want to offer some suggestions why this might not be good small bird habitat? I'd say that there's not very much vegetation there at all, and there's only one species of plants, some small or large grass trees. The next 7 slides I'm going to show are of what is a bit more like the kind of habitat we need to be looking at putting into residential gardens and even in parklands. And I'm not trying to say that it's all going to be like this, but we need pockets, corners, thickets, clumps of something like this. And things to note in this particular slide are the diversity of plants and plantings. There are lots of different shapes of plants, different heights, grasses, shrubs, bigger shrubs, smaller shrubs. There's no brightly coloured bottle brush flowers, and they're mostly small flowers. So the noisy miners and those woolly birds are attracted to the big showy flowers, red ones, orange ones, and the flowers that are on the outside of the plant. whereas insects are attracted to white, cream, yellow, purple and blue flowers, and often they're small flowers, not always. And then when the insects are attracted, then the insect-eating birds are going to be attracted too. Like this. This is a beetle on a tea tree. And the density is really important. You wouldn't actually know what's on the other side of these shrubs. It could be someone's house wall, it could be your fence, it could be your front fence. In fact, on the other side of that particular planting is a river, but you wouldn't know because it's so dense you can't see daylight through. And my rule of thumb is if you can put your arm through into the shrubbery, then a bird the size of a currawong can also get in. So it's got to be that dense that you can't really get inside at all. And you can do that by planting closely together, planting different heights of shrubs. And in this image, there are also vines such as Hardenbergia climbing over to even increase that density further. Here's a fairy wren inside some dense planting. And you can see he's right inside. And he must be feeling safe because I got quite close to take that photo. And he's not far off the ground. Tangled branches, they like tangled branches to be safe. Again, that protection from predators. Some leaf litter and a bit of messiness for some invertebrate habitat. It doesn't have to be the whole garden, just a corner where some insects can survive and thrive, and the birds will find it. And of course, water. We all need water, birds need water, particularly on hot days, but the bird bath needs to be somewhere close to some shrubbery or somewhere that they can quickly jump out and hide in if predators come along. And it has to have water in it. Unlike this one, which is wrong for a number of reasons. Firstly, it doesn't have any water in it. Secondly, it's not too close to anything dense and safe to hide in. But the main thing that I think is particularly wrong with this bird bath is that it's really steep. The side's really steep and the bird's not going to feel safe there because if it fills up with rain, they will be afraid of drowning and they won't want to use it. So a bit more about, the heading's disappeared. This slide is about planting for Nectarivores. So those birds like Eastern Spinebill, New Holland Honeyeater and the white-plumed honeyeater. They like anything with nectar, but not those big showy ones. So Banksias are good, a lot of the Melaleucas are good. The Epacarids are great. You can see in this image of the, I think it's someone help me, it says Stiphelia, no, one of those Epacarids. It's got a long tube-shaped flower and it perfectly matches the beak shape of those honeyeaters like that Eastern Spinebill and the New Holland Honeyeater. This slide says at the top, planting for Insectivores. Of course, they're anywhere with insects. So we have a fairy wren, an eastern yellow robin, a pardalote, thank you, and a woolly wagtail, and they like anywhere with insects. So insect attracting plants could be acacias, leptospermums, native peas, herbaceous, lawn mulch and leaf litter. Julian, I can't go to the next slide now, please.
Okay.
Yeah, we're back. So I guess even small birds like fairy wrens do like foraging on lawns. They do need somewhere to run and hide, but for our Waverley Council staff here, this is actually at Bronte Beach, Bronte Park, right near where that little train is. This is just down the road from that last photo, and this is fantastic, superb fairy wren habitat. It's got dense tangled shrubs and no trees for predator birds like currawongs to hang out in. And this is a spot that I can just about go to any time and find some fairy wrens. A bit more about plant selection and a bit of repetition. Choose plants that attract insects. Choose plants that flower at various times of the year, so you're attracting insects not just at one time of the year. Lectospermums, melaleucas, acacias, correas, cacrids, berseria, and astringia can all be good. But the important thing is shrubs between 1 and 3 metres tall, and they don't have to all be native plants. And they, it's the structure and it's the density of the planting that's the important thing. And at Waverley, we require 50% of the trees, 50% of the shrubs, and 50% of the grasses and ground covers to be locally indigenous species. If landscaping is occurring on a new development, that's within a designated habitat corridor. But it's probably not a bad rule to follow for any garden, to go for at least 50% and have at least those 3 layers of vegetation canopy, whether that's trees or high shrubs, then a middle layer of other shrubs, and then a ground cover and grass layer. And you can include non-natives in that. Lemon trees we know are fantastic for attracting superb fairy wrens. The aphids come to the lemon trees and the fairy wrens come to the aphids. Climbing roses, ornamental species, old school plants like plumbagos are great. And I'm even going to put myself out there and say lantana is great in the city. I wouldn't recommend it up the north coast or somewhere where there's bushland, but the benefits of lantana for small birds far outweigh the weed nuisance that they can have cause in the city. Then you've got the other non-native climbers like bougainvilleas, honeysuckle, jasmine. They're all been found to be great small bird habitat. But as I mentioned already, not planting certain species is just as important. Please avoid planting hybrid grevilleas, Robin Gordon, Sandra Gordon, the other Gordon, those ones that are really popular, and the bottle brush, those bright red bottle brushes, because they will attract noisy miners, and noisy miners will just dominate a territory and there won't be any other bird species around. And it's a bit sad that for the last 40 years we've been encouraged to plant these big flowering natives, because it's probably going to take a while to undo the damage that that's caused. This is not just a problem for small bird species, as I mentioned, it's also larger birds and other animals. Just noisy miners are just so aggressive and so dominant. To demonstrate that, here's a graph of percentage of gardens with small bird species when there are noisy miners and when there are not noisy miners. So the blue columns are gardens with no noisy miners and how many small bird species, and then the red column is the gardens where there are noisy miners. So in every single case, the fairy wren, the red-brown finch, eastern spinebill, silver eye, eastern yellow robin, New Holland honeyeater, and the willy wagtail, lots more of those when there's no noisy miners in the garden. And here's a drawing of sort of the top part of the drawing is a typical planting design. Plant some trees, put them in rows, put spaces in between them. And the lower picture is how to plant so that the noisy miners don't have that habitat that they can swoop through in between the trees and chase all the other birds out. It's got layers, there's no spaces between the plants, and it's got quite a diversity of tall shrubs, small shrubs, grasses, vines, etc. And here's a sort of bird's eye view of the same kind of concept. Instead of same species in a row, or keep those and then just fill it in with other species, and don't have a straight edge so that the There are little keyhole shapes and other nooks and crannies for small birds to hide in. I'm just going to show you a few slides now of some gardens that go some way to fulfilling that vision. This one's good. It's got foraging area on lawn with some other with shrubs right beside the lawn, different layers, quite a diversity of species. Same again here. It's even got a little sort of a circular lawn in the middle of all those shrubs, so that if a predator comes here, that bird's got options of which way it can run and hide, or fly and hide. Bird bath here is in a great position with shrubs all around it. Again, that's hiding a fence. You can see sort of in the shadow that might be a fence, but it's pretty well concealed. Variety of species. Nice dense planting. You can make native plantings look non-messy if you want to do a lot of pruning and just sort of regular tip pruning to make nice shapes, so that birds don't mind if the westringer's in a nice ball or it's a bit more scraggly. Here we've got some good mulch area, and this one there's not a native inside. I don't think there's anything planted in the ground, but it's still got somewhere that a small bird could stop off flying through the landscape. That's safe in that bougainvillea. This one's on a rooftop, probably needs a bit more mid-story, but it's not bad for a rooftop garden. This is another really nice one. Again, might need a bit more mid-story, but lots of nice diverse natives there. And these two are public places. This is some plantings that we've done in recent years at Waverley, correas and westringers. That's very popular with fairy wrens now. It's grown. It took about 18 months to 2 years to grow to a size that they felt comfortable in using. Oh, there's a slide missing. Never mind. Lastly, I just want to talk about some research resources that you can look up and find out a bit more for yourself. The Birds in Backyards Guidelines for Bird Habitat's great. They've got downloadable fact sheets for all different kinds of purposes, domestic gardens, schools, landscape architects, and the like. And of course, Birds in Backyards is a great resource for any information about birds, whether you want to know what they sound like, look like. They've got a great bird finder. You can just put in the shape of the bird and it'll come up with some options to help you narrow down what you're looking at. This is from Habitat Network. It's a really nice diagram about how to plant different layers in a circular kind of pattern, so that the birds have got the inner sanctum where they can spend some time, the protective circle, which is the prickly shrubs. And that's the first time I'm saying prickly shrubs in this presentation for a reason, because I don't think they're really great for stepping stones or too much habitat, but I do know that birds like to nest in there, and it's good to keep cats out of other shrubs behind them. And then there's some insect attracting plants on the outer side. So this circular idea can be looked at again from above, and there's some lines drawn across here to demonstrate that it doesn't have to be a big space. If you're in a public space, you might want to do all of those circles, but if you're in a backyard and you don't want to do the whole backyard like this, you could just do a little pie slice in the corner and still have some inner sanctum plants, protective and biodiverse insect attracting plants on the outside. So you can scale it up or down. The Habitat Network has lots of great species recommendations too. You can see on the right-hand side of that slide. Then there's Habitat Stepping Stones, which some councils have signed up to, and you can look up your council area and it will give you suitable species to plant in your garden, and it gives quite a nice profile of each plant, what species of birds and insects they might attract, how big they're going to grow, what time they flower. and that sort of thing. There's also the Glebe Society. This is one I did for the Glebe Society a few years ago, but in the back of that document is a species list and some other drawings. And that's on glebesociety.org. So I'll end it there with just sum up some top tips. Make sure your shrubs reach all the way to the ground. Plant thick, densely. Think of clumps and thickets. Avoid the big showy bird Waverley species. Don't forget water. I haven't mentioned much about insects because that's going to be Steve's thing, but I would say don't use any insect pesticides, whether it's the natural organic kind or the more poisonous kind, that they all get rid of insects. I think we're losing a lot of our insect-eating species because we're losing insects. I think that's it for me, and I will pass it back to Vicky and for question time.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Sue. Are there any questions?
I've been trying to persuade create an understory habitat for birds in Barn Park. And they tell me they can't do it, they won't do it because so the police, when the police drive around, they won't have to get out of the car. They want to be able to see into the park, so all the trees are cut. All the undergrowth is cut so that you can see into the park. I mean, is there a way of dealing with that?
We did do a tree planting at Barn Park for National Tree Day, which would have been understory and shrubs for small birds. Do you have a comment on that, Sue?
I don't have any non-controversial comments. I think it's quite on the point there. There's been a lot of talk, not so much recently, but in the days there were quite a lot of bag snatchings and things like that, that shrubs were bad. Shrubs were where criminals would hide, and so get rid of all the shrubs and you'll get rid of the criminals. Of course, we've moved on now. Most criminals are online and they don't hide in shrubs. And so I really don't think it's a big issue now, even if it ever was. But there's still a lot of people with that kind of thinking. We are trying to build up shrub layers in places that we can, and we did do the National Tree Day planting at Varna Park, and we want to keep rolling that out. But it's not the way everybody wants to see the landscape. There's still a fear factor around shrubs, which I think we've really got to move on.
So is the division within council as to sort of management of the parks?
Council has quite a number of different departments that manage parks. As urban ecology department, that's my vision. It might not be shared by everyone. I don't think I'm going to say.
So just a comment from here in the chat is that Barnes Park, Bondi Temperament area has been stripped of shrubs as well. So there's more feedback about areas where there's been a loss.
Yeah. Look, some of them were lost for a whole lot of reasons. I don't want to encourage too much council bashing. I think we want to talk more about positive things and how we can create habitat. Marks Park has had some plants disappear, but we're putting some back too. It's, plants are living things. They're not the sort of thing that you put there like building a house and it's going to stay there for 20 years. You have to keep looking after them, replacing things that are lost. That's how it is with living things.
Michelle, are there any questions on the chat?
That's pretty much it. Just the only other thing was just checking that the slides will be shared with everyone afterwards. So we are sending out follow-up email with slides and other bits and things.
So we are recording the session, or we'll be sending out a resource page and a recording of the workshop. So there's a question that was asked prior to tonight. Or Sue and maybe Mark could answer this as well. What species can work well in urban areas alongside footpaths that can withstand some rough handling from pedestrians? Do you want to answer that? Or?
I would go for some tough ground covers. I'm not going to go into particular species because there's a whole lot of variables. Is it in the shade? Is it in the sun? What kind of soil have you got? What kind of water runoff do you have? So recommending a certain species without knowing anything else is probably not a good idea. But there's quite a number of quite hardy ground covers, even native grasses such as basket grass could be really useful. So it can be trodden on without too much damage being done.
Can I just talk about downtown? I'm involved in some, and I cleared a lot of lantana. I found that I suddenly lost my fairy wrens. As a result, I suspect that they were, and I'm just reinforcing what you were saying, and so it's a dilemma for me wanting to plant a native garden and having tons of lantana.
Yes, I think we've got to take a much more holistic view and a less of that sort of native is good, weeds is bad kind of view. If you want to have habitat, I think a lot of future generations started off with a plant-based kind of perspective, and it was just about plants. This is good, this is bad, but we know now after doing future generation for 20 years, 40 years, that we've lost a lot of small bird habitat by taking out lantana, and I know bush generators now that say that lantana destruction is the same as small bird destruction. So you've got to have to look at what you want in your landscape. Do you just want native plants, or do you want some more life that?
But will they come back if I remove the lantana and plant the plants that you're suggesting?
It depends if they can get there. It's just stepping stones and corridors from somewhere that they're currently living. If they can get in and out to your new space, it's possible. Every season, the females get kicked out of the family group and they have to go and find a new territory. So if there's a way to get there, then it's possible that they'll come back.
Would you suggest doing it bit by bit, staging it?
Staging lantana removal. Yeah, very, very, very slowly. Make sure that the shrubs that you're replacing that lantana with grow to the same size and density of that the lantana was before you remove the next thing. We're going really, really slowly. It takes 10, 15 years to just do a small area if you do it that way. That's why you probably keep it.
Okay. Thanks, Sue. I think we might move on now. We're going to hear from Narelle next. Want to swap places or we can just get this one?
Would you like to stay?
Narelle's going to delve a little bit deeper into garden design using native plants
Screen share happen straight away.
and how to benefit from local wildlife.
Is it on? Oh. That's better.
Hi everyone, my name is Narelle. I'm from a garden for life, so I specialise in native plant design, garden design, and I have my own business at Garden for Life, but I also work and design for Sydney Wildflower Nursery, which is the native nursery down at Heathcote in the National Park. So I've been designing for them for a very long time, which is something I still stay designing for them because I actually think it keeps me in touch with the plants quite closely. So I was trying to find some images of gardens that, a few examples of gardens that I've created with some clients who are very keen on birdscaping. So when I go to people's gardens, they kind of there's a couple of, it's very, as other designers will tell you, there's many different types of clients, and some of them just want a garden which you put it in and they've got no attachment to it, and others will have quite a big discussion with you. I find one of the hardest things to get people to change is the front lawn. Everyone seems to love a front lawn, and one of my first questions will say, how do you feel about getting rid of your front lawn? Because if you have a family and you want to create a garden to be involved with not only you, but your children, say, or entertaining, but then you also want to create a native habitat, then maybe start in the front, because you may be using your backyard for a lot more things, but I think the front yard is like a key space that can be used for habitat, and a lot more people are embracing it. I do find some people are still attached to the lawnmower and want to keep some of that, which we were saying before is actually okay, because it's good to have a bit of lawn there. But say, for example, this client, her and her husband decided that she would have the front garden and he would have the back, and I had two different separate consultations with this couple. So I had one consultation with her, and this is actually a front verge, and we started on the front verge because it literally, as most front verges are just grass, and there wasn't any policy at this time, so I'm in the Wollongong Council. There is now a verge policy, which is fantastic. But at the time I had to go and ask permission, and we had to show the design and talk about the plants that we were going to use, which was great because at least they were interested in what we were doing. So she took out some of the lawn against the fence, because this was just a fence with lawn all the way to the verge. Can I go forward on this? Is it just the arrow? That's it now. That's same one. So that's when we just first started, and that's quite densely grown now. But what I pointed out to her is she wanted to keep it very close to the fence, and there was still a lot of open lawn leading up to that. So now what we've done is we've allowed just a small pathway through the middle, and she's actually densely planted with low plantings all on the other side, which is close to the gutter. So there's actually a space to hop over and not just have this very exposed, dense area there. She's actually got one next to it as well. So it was a vast improvement. You can't see the fence anymore, which is perfect for me, because especially when I go to people's houses, and colour-bond fencing is like a disease in the urban area. And to me, if you can cover it with something like that instead, it's twofold. It's reducing heat in your garden, it's creating habitat for the birds, and it's an attractive space. This was her husband's backyard. So it was literally just a rectangular lawn. And so we took out a lot of the lawn. He's still got his veggie patch and lawn on the other side, but we densely planted with a lot of local low-growing species. They wanted to keep the palms and a couple of other larger things, but you can see that we've used a lot of very low-growing, dense plantings there, so that the birds have got a lot of habitat. And he's quite keen and has been recording a lot of small bird species in that garden since. But when it was just a lawn with a palm tree by itself and some lily pillies on the side, there was pretty much not much activity at all. The other problem that people have, and this is just an example of foliage, people sort of talk to me about native gardens, but isn't it just scrubby and it's a little bit ugly and it's all messy? And I said, you don't have to have your garden like that. If you're in a small space, if you're pruning your garden, if you're maintaining the garden, making sure the plants are fed and mulched, and you are repeating some of the same plants through the space, you can actually achieve all the things that we've just spoken about with bird habitat, but you can have a really attractive space as well. So this was a front lawn that was just a sloping front lawn with nothing in it, and they thankfully took out the entire front lawn, and it's grown quite well. And you can see there's quite a few different species in there. There's kangaroo claws, there's wisteria, there's saltbush, there's acacias, and there's lots of different grasses. And it's a beautiful garden. I think there's another shot of it there. This is still it's only about 2 years old at this stage, so it's grown a lot more since then. But it's a beautiful space for habitat. It's got aeromophilus in there, some banksias. But you can see it's aesthetically, it's quite a pleasing space to be looking at as well. It's much nicer than she said, it's the talk of the street, because every other house in that street has just a front lawn. So the only issue I guess with that is encouraging others to do their front lawns as well, so that there's somewhere for those birds to travel, because she's isolated, obviously, with all the other lawns. So it's encouraging other people. And by doing gardens like this, it actually gets people excited, and then they want to start doing it too. And you'll find people chipping away and starting to put gardens in. This is a very, very recent garden that was planted in a disability service. So I've done quite a few habitat gardens for people with disabilities, because they've obviously, this place was people are actually, they can't leave there. So these were adults, and they said one of the inhabitants, they loved water. So we said, well, let's create some water, and this will grow. As you can see, the plants are very tiny so far. But this is an area that was just lawn before, all lawn, and beyond it, you can see beyond the fence, that was all lawn. So now this is created with a lot of very low growing species and a water source as well. And beyond the fence, it is now not lawn anymore either. There's a lot of plantings there. So the birds have got a beautiful space to create, but it's also aesthetically for people with mental health issues and intellectual disabilities. This is a really important space for them, and they've found that a lot of people living there now are a lot calmer, because they've got this habitat rather than just walking out into just a vast lawn area with nothing for them to do. So that's another shot of it there, and you can see once it grows up, it's going to be quite a beautiful space. This is a garden that was created last year. And again, they wanted to share the space with plants and animals, and obviously they were quite entertaining. The only thing I wasn't that keen on, that little circle in the middle, they put a big gum in there just by itself, which to me it's like that example you had of the plants planted along the fence. Whereas the rest of the area, I was encouraging them to put a lot more dense planting. So I think they've realised now they're going to take that out. This is 6 months later, so it's already growing quite a bit. And you can see we've got a diversity of low growing plants with grasses, ground cover, and there's a space that's going completely around the garden. And they're lucky with lending off some plants off the neighbours as well. This is a Waverley. It was a waterfront property, and the clients and I went for a walk along the beach, along the coastal walk, because they're right on that coastal walk. And we looked at what species were growing along the coastal walk, because it was important for them to bring birds into the gardens. And then we sort of copied that style into their garden. And this is still growing, but you can see there's grasses again, and ground cover, lots of low growing shrubs, because just beyond their little fence was the other side of the walk. So those birds and animals that are hanging around in those areas can then just hop over the fence and be in their garden as well. So some of the plant species I was interesting, because I was talking about all the local species, and I agree that we should put in 50% of the plant species from your area. But when I'm at the nursery and I'm meeting clients, they obviously see lots of pretty little things that they want to put in. So I talked to them about using species maybe that they can use to create that look thereafter, but also beneficial for the animals. And you see there's a bee. This is the Leonema green screen, which has a really nice dense habit. It's also got quite tiny flowers. Obviously the bees love it, so it's a good one to use in the garden. Homoranthus, does everyone know Homoranthus? That's quite, because I also get asked to create styles of gardens. So people say, oh, I want native plants, but I want it to be Japanese. So that's or something quite formal. So I'll try and use plants to have a bit of structure to them, but also create quite a habit for the plants. I don't know if you've ever smelt this plant when it's in flower, but it smells like Anzac biscuits. So it's got a beautiful fragrance to it. So the animals are very attracted to the fragrance. I find when we get into, when I think about pest control and insect problems, if you're having more of these sort of fragrant plants in the garden, it can also help as well. Some of the pests, I'm sure you're going to talk about that. Anyway, that's another really nice, dense, layered, small growing plant that people may not have heard of before. Now this one is a Lamatia solifolia. A lot of people mistake this for a grevillea, but I find this has a really beautiful habit. And although it's got a bigger flower, I find because of the style that actually I've seen lots of very small birds in this habit. I don't know whether you've seen it. Do you that plant? Yeah. So that has quite a beautiful habit, and its flowers are incredibly fragrant. Now, the reason I put the gum in, because obviously this is very fashionable and everyone wants to put in a grafted gum. They're from Western Australia. They're very striking and, you know, very eye-catching. But again, it's for a lot of the larger birds. So I encourage people to use, maybe if they want a gum to put in something, there's a few interesting smaller hybrids, like there's one called Eucalyptus Moon Lagoon, which has a really beautiful small habit and very small flowers. It's got that grey foliage, which is like a silver dollar gum, if people know that, but it's got a very small habit and it lends itself more beautifully. These are very beautiful and they're very showy, but it's that large flower that we're trying to attract the big birds with. Solia, now sometimes people don't like solia because it can be a bit of a weed in some parts of Australia. It's now called Velardearia petrophila, but it's got a beautiful blue flower, and it's the habit of this I quite like. I used it on the south side of the colourboard fence because it's a climber, but it also acts like a shrub, and it's very dense, and I find a lot of the small birds can hide in behind it. Has anyone used that before? Solia? Have you used solia in the garden?
Kind of stick in the plantings that we do.
You're just using local species.
Stick to the locals.
Yeah.
But, it's really nice.
Yeah, it's really big flower. Crinum pedunculata, I find that there's a lot of, this is sort of a structural plant that I would use in amongst the other shrubs. It attracts a lot of insects, so the birds who are insect eaters like it. And you can see behind it, there's one on the left, Sperman burgundies, which has a really beautiful colour to it. So when I'm talking about using different plants that actually the small birds like, but also creating a beautiful design for your garden, so you can use ones that have foliage colour and also habitat, because the birds actually really love to get in between those climb lilies. Darwinia, taxifolia, that's a really great shrub for small birds. It looks spikier than it is, but it's actually got a very sweet nectar, and it attracts a lot of insects, so the insect eaters really love it. You'll see that through the bush locally. And this one, surprisingly, this is Tecumseh Ankylia, which is a Fraser Island creeper, and although it's got a bit of a larger flower, I've seen a lot of eastern spinebills on this. This is down, has anyone ever been to the Grevillea Park down at Batley? That's a really beautiful park that's open soon, I think. So you can go and have a look there, and they've got a lot of species, a lot of local species, but also a lot of species that are from elsewhere, and you can see how they're put into a habitat style garden. Chrysanthemums, the mid-bush, I find that they are not only fragrant, but the small birds seem to love the flowers. So, and that's another fragrant plant that helps either attract or detect the insects. It's really dense growing. It gets a little bit woody underneath, but actually that's a part that actually the small birds quite like. It's living in that woody structure. You can see here it's growing with some grasses. Hobias. Do you use hobias in the garden at all? No. Yeah. So the pea flowers, there's a plethora of pea flowers that are local as well. This one sort of always surprises me because it sort of disappears in the garden, and then as soon as it comes out in flower, you notice that it's there again. Archotomyrta speculari, which is a rose myrtle. That's actually a bush tucker plant. And it attracts a lot of insects, but it also can be quite low growing. One of the things I sort of say to people too, if they're attracted to a local species, but it's going to grow too big for their habit, they actually can prune it. It's not like you wake up the next morning and overnight the plant's grown to 6 metres. You actually have time to prune it. So this one actually creates a really nice, small, dense shrub and has fruit for fruit eaters. Kunzia ambigua is, there's a tick bush, there's also a dwarf variety, there is also a ground cover, which you can use for this variety of plant. And the Canadian nigricans I've found is really quite a nice habitat for small birds because it's a very vigorous climber, but again, it gets a lot of woody material underneath, and it's got a very unusual flower. You can see that black and yellow flower. So I think that's it for mine, but I find when I'm doing it, because you know, you're talking about like having sort of areas in the garden, and it was sort of creating it sort of to be a little bit messier. People sort of say to me, oh, but I don't want that. But I said, you can still create that same environment and have the grasses, and you can have the small shrubs and have the contrasting foliage and the different flowering times and create that and still have your beautiful bird bath in the middle. It'll look aesthetic to you, especially if you repeat some of those shrubs through the garden. But I find that on the other hand, it can still be a neat garden, but create that habitat for those birds. It doesn't need to be, people sort of say, oh, you're a native designer, oh, you just do it, you just make scrub gardens. And it's like, oh, have you visited a native nursery recently? Come and see some examples of the garden, like the ones I showed you. You can still create habitat and have something that's aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Narelle. You mentioned, told us about one of the residents, I think it was Waverley, you went out and had a look along the coastal walk and had a look at vegetation growing there. Do you find is that a good way to introduce the concept to your clients and to talk about how they can connect?
Yeah, it is, because I think people have got a bit removed from their gardens. They're sort of not realising they're part of a bigger habitat, and like it's not just, you know, people have got it in their own space. If they get outside that space and we walked on there and said, what do you like about this space? And they said, oh, there's a lot of activity, there's birds, it's lovely sounds, you can see the plants are all growing beautifully together. And I said, if you're growing this in your garden, one, it's going to be successful because they already grow here. But that's what you want. You want some life in your garden. You don't want it to just be a flat palette of plants. Yeah.
Are there any questions in the room?
My question is, previously you mentioned that the preferred type of shrubs would be some that are quite dense. And so the question is there something like shrub that might be too dense? Like what comes in mind is like, for example, like more of the classic shrubs in gardens like English box, Fonicera, like having those would be still like achieve the same like outcome they attract birds.
Well, you need some gaps in the areas for the birds to get in behind it. Because a lot of plants that can be densely pruned will still have sort of a woodiness underneath. They're not all going to be, if they can get in behind that area, but yeah, or even if it has to sort of stop somewhere, like you still need somewhere for the birds to get in, because some of them are so densely pruned, they look impervious, like you can't get in.
What about something like the native citrus?
Yeah.
It's really important, so that's why I was thinking that's.
Yeah, they do, but they do. You've got to prune it quite a bit because they get sort of create a trunk quite a bit. So I use a lot of bush foods in my gardens, and I would do that, but I would also be planting something underneath because they actually become quite open. Yeah, and they're actually quite a shade lover. Interesting.
And let's say like just a large plant or main grass, it's like a 1 meter tall. Is it still interesting? Like what's grows in
Oh, okay. Sorry. So the question. So you're worried if it's just Lamandra or it's.
If there's a situation where I can just create something larger but just trappy without those bushes, is it still work as a habitat or?
Using just grasses, maybe?
Yeah, let's say like just.
Yeah, but I would use like a diversity of grasses that are local.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question was sort of whether if we just use grasses rather than shrubs, whether you could still create that habitat. And the answer is yes, because I would use a lot of different species of grasses. I wouldn't use just Lamandra. You would use some Poa species, or you would use some Picinia or other grasses that are from that area. They will use it as a corridor, and also a lot of the grasses like the Poas have a lot of dieback underneath, so they'll use that as a sort of protective layer as well. Obviously, if they need nectar or they want to eat insects and it's not being attracted to that grass, they're obviously going to keep moving along. Like it would be good to have some other shrubs in there as well. You don't want just a sort of a monoculture of species. That's just as bad as having a row of trees. Like you still need something else in there as well.
Any questions online, Michelle?
The main question coming from online is that it's difficult for people online to pick up all the species names, and perhaps we can type up a list of
Yeah,
species.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I might bring Mark in for a moment now. Prior to tonight, we did have a question. We're always asking about shade-loving natives, and this is something we're always coming up across in the living connections. Can you give us a few of your favourite shade? I don't think any of them love shade, but a few natives that tolerate the shade.
Well, there's always the native violets. There's quite often when we have shady areas, it can be difficult for these birds that we focus on to live in these areas as well. So we have to maybe go from a heathland type of environment to a more tropical sort of area and borrow plants from areas that are more suitable to tropical areas, subtropical. Some of the local species though are the hopbush, braynias and fabaliums. Fabaliums are actually a local species. Monotocas, a bush tucker plant, midgeonberry, Ostromertus dulcis. Warrigal greens go quite well in the coastal areas, in the sandy areas. It's edible species as well. Warrigal greens or native spinach. Fantastic ground cover, very good for insects and lizards to hide in as well. Dianellas and lamandras always used as a last resort native species because they're very reliable, but they can grow quite vigorously as well. But for certain more difficult spots, you can use them quite. It's very handy to use those as well. It's also the Dianellas are a native edible species for the berries. They spread quite well through the berries as well as vegetatively. Lamandras are actually a fantastic nesting plant as well for the wrens. They do quite well in the shaded areas as well. It's not necessarily one of the species that you might use in your gardens because it's more aesthetically pleasing. But yeah, I do like the look of them. And sometimes people do like the look of them. Another species of the Lamandra is the hystrix, although that tends to grow more sort of in northern areas, northern New South Wales, Queensland. It has a much different look, I find. They're similar, but they're much more elegant. They do better still in shaded areas. They're somewhat taller and they divide quite readily as well. They're much more vigorous in these areas. I love some of the ferns. There's plenty of ferns we can use. Dudia is a favorite of mine, rasp fern. It's just got a beautiful color to it, Dudia aspera. It's got a beautiful red new foliage color that drops back against the darker green, nice structure of the leaf as well. Bulwara, Eupomacia lorina, is also a bush tucker plant. It's got a lovely smell when the flowers are out. It grows quite large. It is local to the Sydney region, but not so much here on the coast. Let's see what else we can have. The fabaliums are quite good. Monotocas. That's probably around it. About it. I just would like to refer to, rather than looking at species, check your local bushland as well, because there's so many fantastic examples rather than going off lists, species lists. Okay.
Narelle's question about small gardens. Are there any plants that you can suggest for a very small space?
Well, with small gardens, I always go up the, I'd use the the space, like using your fences as well to grow things on. So you start there, using lots of grasses, a lot of small shrubs. You can actually fit a lot into a small garden. Like vertical gardens have become very popular, which then you can create a garden bed along the base. I mean, depends how you want to use your garden. If it's because I do a lot of terraces and a lot of small gardens, but I went to one recently in Leichhardt, and I think it was about 4 meters by 3 meters, the garden, but they had crammed a hell of a lot into this garden. But it depends how you want to use it. So I would put some curves into the garden, which actually makes it look bigger anyway, and then you can create some more edges and have things creeping out onto the path, having your different layers. It's actually a more aesthetically pleasing place to be if you just had paving and some fencing. So you can actually fit a lot. It's just being clever with using those vertical spaces, making sure you go up as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Narelle. Thank you, Narelle. We're going to hear from Steve now. Steve is going to present on how it sort of fits into a holistic ecosystem management and how that all ties in with this.
Thank you. So you guys are here, designers, managers, yes, sorry, designers, yeah, and managers. No, neither of the above. Garden managers, horticulturists. Yeah, thank you. Look, I've really enjoyed listening to you guys, and I think I knew you were coming on with lots of interesting information about plants and how to design ecosystems and different ways to do it. I thought I'd bring in maybe a slightly different take on it and dive deep into what it is an ecosystem and how can we really nurture one and make it thrive. So we might got an amazing looking PowerPoint here, but birds are the result of a complex ecosystem. They don't you don't just pop in a shrub and a bird pops up with it. So how do we look at our ecosystems? How do we manage them? How do we design them to get as many birds as we possibly can? And there's a couple of tools that I use. I just want to introduce you to those fairly quickly. Holistic management is one of them. I've just heard about it about a year ago and just starting to really understand what it's all about. But it's fantastic framework for managing ecosystems and looking at how ecosystems function. And the other one is permaculture, which I've been sort of dabbling with for about 25 years. I think Narelle's at me as well. So it also provides a framework for looking at the garden as a whole, and hopefully got some tools that you can use to create great homes for birds, to bring as many birds and as much life as you can. You're probably all over this. This is probably like year 10 science or year 7 science, but I thought I'd show it anyway because, what's the driver? This is a very simple breakdown of a very complex ecosystem, and we're looking at the plants and the animals and with a bit of a focus on the soil. You'll notice on the right we have birds and animals, and they're actually the result of all these other complex systems that are happening and these interactions and these food webs. And a lot of it's driven from the soil, but there's an equally kind of complex system above the ground as well. Starts with the sun, so photosynthesis drives the whole thing. So how do we as designers and managers pump as much sunlight energy into our system as we can, because that's the driver of the whole thing. I don't have time for Q&A, so I think Sue and Narelle's images kind of some of those really nailed this one home. So lots of plants, lots of diversity, stacking of plants, different leaf shapes, different leaf colours. If you can have the maximum number of amount of leaf area, you've got the maximum amount of sunlight being captured and pumping energy in the form of sugars down through the roots and into the soil. That energy is feeding nematodes, fungi, bacteria, and countless other critters that are living there. So the plants are actually feeding the ecosystem. The other driver to the ecosystem is organic matter. So mulch is really important. when you're managing the landscape and you're pruning and making your garden look really nice, one thing you can do is the thing in permaculture called chop and drop. So you just put to place carefully and neatly all that material on top of the ground, and all your worms and your bacteria, fungi, and things will come and eat that organic matter and turn it into good soil, which drives plant growth. We might go, yeah, and so all these first or second order critters are being eaten by more complex critters, and they're being eaten by more complex critters, such as insects and things, and then they feed birds. Without this, you wouldn't have those, and the birds have got nothing to eat. All right, so holistic management, it's a bit complicated, but it's a really amazing thing. But if we can, I can't really point, but if you look at the ecosystem processes, the water cycle, mineral cycle, community dynamics, and energy flow. So the holistic management framework, part of it is looking at those functions of the ecosystem, and as you're managing or designing, how can you maximize those? So we talk about energy flow. You know, the energy going into the soil feeds the community dynamics. The more energy, the more community dynamics, which is basically the animals that you're living in the soil. Organic matter breaking down is the mineral cycle. Those will all improve the water cycle. So if your soil has got more organic matter, it soaks in more water, it holds more water, your plants grow better. They're all connected. They're all basically different ways of looking at the same thing, the same ecosystem. If you can maximize all of those four things, then you probably have more potential for your ecosystem to support birds. Permaculture. Again, there's quite a bit of permaculture. It's really interesting, but it's essentially a framework for creating ecosystems. It's got to focus on food and providing things that humans need, but it's also all about diversity and homes for animals as well. So, you know, you can call on your ethics when you're designing or when you're managing a landscape. Very simple ethics, care of the earth. If what you're doing is not under that banner of caring for the earth, maybe think about doing something else. I think Sue mentioned not spraying chemicals. You know, if we simply get out the spray can, we just wipe out this whole dynamic system. We start killing things. So shift into that nurturing and that life, providing life focus. You know, then you got the principles, observe and interact. You should always be looking at your ecosystem. You know, what's living here? What insects are around? You know, can I convince my client that it's okay to have psyllids on their lily pads? It's a good thing because it's food for small birds. Can we see that? Yeah, sure, they'll get a bit distorted for a little while, but we can prune them or not. Birds will come and eat the psyllids, and the plants will grow back anyway. You know, use and value diversity. So there's a lot of these that you can filter your ideas through and your management through. So hopefully, really drive this web of life. Because the birds, the insectivorous birds anyway, so at the top of that web. And we as managers and designers can really maximize the life in that cycle, the life in that web to get nice birds. I think that's it. Yeah, so check it out. If you haven't looked into holistic management, I recommend it. If you haven't looked into permaculture, I recommend it. That's some good stuff in there.
Thanks. Any questions for Steve? Holistic management, permaculture?
I have brought in watering. So I've got a lot of constantly trying to persuade clients to put water in, but very afraid of it.
Water. So the question was, how important is water in the landscape, as in ponds and still water? Look, it massively increases the habitat value of a garden. I think, you know, everything needs water, as far as I know. So I think if you had a garden without a pond and the same garden with a pond, I think the one with a pond would probably have more birds because it would have more life, you know, potentially. What are and your clients, was it this?
I just always concerned about mosquitoes and stuff.
Yeah. they're easy to manage. Yeah, mozzie little fish, there's little native Australian fish that will live in a pond quite happily, and they'll coexist with frogs and insects, and well, they'll eat the mozzies. Oh, species. There's gudgeons, I think might be one. I think there's a pools to ponds is a really good resource for fish species. Coringa Council. Yeah, definitely. If you can incorporate water, for sure. It adds that X factor.
Any other questions in the room?
I have one from Narelle Steve. How important is mangrove habitat for small birds as well as insects?
Questions about mangrove habitat?
Well, it's pretty good for insects, isn't it? Yeah, well, it's pretty dense habitat, but it depends what's growing along the land beside the mangroves, I find, because mangroves can be very monoculture in themselves. There's still birds that live in there, but it's good to have other grasses and shrubs growing beside the mangroves, I think, to give them some diversity, because it can be, you know, if you agree with that. There's insects, great, they love it. Yeah.
I know where there's mangroves, there seems to be little birds around. I don't know if it's because they're particularly wild kind of areas that are left alone a bit, but I know mangroves are really important for fish.
And they're often quite a long corridor for them to travel along the birds. So there's a lot of protection along the way.
Any specific thoughts on the Waverley Creek mangrove corridor?
Questions on the Waverley Creek mangrove corridor? Do you really?
I'm not aware of the Waverley Creek.
I know, yeah.
Waverley Creek mangrove
So
corridor. I live just near there, and the mangroves that are close to my house are roosting.
I live just near the confluence of Wallow Creek and Cook's River, and the mangroves near my place they have a few interesting birds like the mangrove heron and some doves that you don't see everywhere else. But as well as that, there are hundreds of Indian miners, common miners. Every night they go down to roost in there, hundreds. So I'm not sure if that's just an inner city thing. But I think Narelle's on it here with, it depends on what's growing beside the mangroves. The mangroves themselves, great fish habitat, and there's a few birds like the mangrove heron that are kind of specific to there, that's their niche. But yeah, it depends what's next. And Wallow Creek, they've, it's around Narelle Station, they've built right out from the creek line with all sorts of other plants like reeds and grasses like Phragmites and other shrubs to increase the habitat for small birds, and there's quite a few small birds in that other planting, not in the mangroves themselves.
So, Michelle, are there any questions online? No.
Barbara's got a hand up.
Barbara, do you want to ask your question?
Or can she just ask it out loud?
Yes, it's Barbara Schaffer here. It's thank you. Sorry, I am just on a train, but it's a fabulous workshop. Thank you so much. I just wanted to know, has anybody noticed that the Banksia integrifolias in the Bondi, North Bondi area are dying, the larger trees? And if, yeah.
Banksia's dying. I was talking to someone recently who was an arborist, and he said there's a new disease. I don't know whether have you heard about this?
I'm not an arborist, I don't know about diseases of trees that much, but I do know that the Banksia integrifolias around Waverley, LGA, are the first to drop leaves in storms, and sometimes the whole
tree goes over. I think sometimes there's some human intervention in vaccine foliar deaths as well around that area. But it's quite possible that there's insect and other disease factors going on as well. And I'm not sure, no one's done any research, but maybe it's a climate change thing. Yeah, but there's something going on there.
Yeah, in our street alone, there are 2 trees which are probably within approximately 25 years old, which have basically just died.
Happens. Sometimes.
One suggestion on the chat is that it could be
Yeah, that's what it's not rain. We had those extreme weather events. It's a lot of bugs and things. Weird.
Okay, I think we're I think we might wrap it up there. I'd like to thank you all for attending, those of you in the room tonight, and thank you to everybody joining us online tonight, and thank you for bearing with all our camera movements as we manoeuvred around the room. So there has been questions about resources and the slides being available. We will send an email out, and this the workshop's been recorded, so you can get a link to that. We'll send slides out where we can. We'll put together a resource list where you can go find more information and some suggested species as well. I hope you found that useful tonight. I think we will finish off there. So thank you very much for joining us.